because we're in a TV studio. So
Nice.
yes, you see the camera behind me, and then I've got cameras in front, and I'm looking at you on a monitor, and then I'm looking at you right here. So you have actually 3 different monitors going. I'll take a picture of all, because yes, we run the show out of New York. So I'm going to quickly introduce you based on this wonderful book that I loved, by the way. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Disabilities Redefined with Dr. Wagner. I am here with the great guy, the author and personality and expert behind Mental Illness is an Asshole. And believe me, it is one great book that I started and read and near about read again. So, but anyway, okay, now Gabe, listen. I said before we started filming that Gabe Howard, everybody, if I didn't say his name, I'm going to say it now. Gabe Howard is our special guest. And again, I'm going to shameless plug one more time. Mental Illness is an Asshole. You can get it on Amazon or anywhere that great books are sold. And I would strongly advise you to pick it up and buy it, because it's great for scholars, laymen, and all of the above. So now you host, Gabe, 2 podcasts, but you're involved with, okay, so what podcast do you host?
I host the Inside Mental Health podcast and the Inside Bipolar podcast.
Okay, so you have those 2 podcasts that you host, but you're also involved with numerous other podcasts, aren't you? Like Our Stigma. I saw something that you're doing something with a podcast called Our Stigma. Is that, or were you just a guest on that one?
I'm just a guest. I love being a guest on podcasts because, of course, that's where my audience is as well.
Right.
So I pop up as a guest on a lot of shows.
You
and
do.
Also podcasters were kind of you know, sometimes we'll swap guest spots on other people's shows and things like that whenever possible. So it's I end up on podcasts a lot. Okay. I like podcasts.
Right. Okay. So that's what it was, because I know one time you were doing something with our great good friend, Michelle Hammer.
Yep.
Yeah. And then Our Stigma, I saw you were doing something with the Mighty. So you were everywhere, which is wonderful because you've got so much to give. So I'm going to start off by asking the first question. You talk a lot about recovery in your book. I appreciate that. And it's not all fun and flowers and the whole 9 yards. Do you think there's a time limit to, or do you even think that we should talk about time and a time limit to recovery, or a before and an after? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that we do need to talk about recovery because we talk about the symptoms and the horror show that is mental illness so much. I mean, you can't turn on the news without hearing all of the negatives surrounding mental illness. You can't go to a doctor without describing your own internal pain and suffering from things like depression and mania and psychosis and anxiety. So if we only have negative descriptors of mental illness, well, then we're all just hopeless and doomed. So we need to talk about recovery, because I don't want to say that's the positive side of mental illness, because there is no positive side of mental illness, but it's the getting over it. It's the moving forward. It's getting to the promised land. It's the taking your life back. It's the empowering yourself. That's what recovery is. And I do think we need a before and after, because how do you mark that you've accomplished something, that you've reached a goal, that you're doing better?
Yes.
I will say that these are deeply personal experiences. And I do think that sometimes people, and you know, I'm kind of looking at my medical folks right now. I think sometimes we create this one size fits all version of recovery. And I think that does a disservice to people. I think it's very intimate. I think it's very personal.
I didn't, to let everybody know, I always send my guest a few topics, but I do want to ask the walking on eggshell factor. I didn't ask you this, and this was not part of the topics, but I'm going to throw it in because I just thought of it. How do you feel about that? Because you just said it yourself. There's not really a positive side to mental illness, and that kind of intimidates people. Yet we want to ask questions. We want to talk about it. So should we walk on eggshells, or should we just come out and ask the question and you guide us? I like that. I like that theory myself. I think
It's a
that
good.
people, and I'll throw this in here. I've said it 1,000 times. I do not understand. I don't. I love to learn, but I don't understand. So sometimes when someone like myself who has not had a diagnosis, we might use a word that is not appropriate. How then do we go about saying, I'm sorry? And then how should
So
you feel? How should your population feel? If that
yeah,
makes
so
any sense. I don't even, am I making sense to you?
no, you're making complete sense. And here is the truth bomb that I'm going to drop on everybody that makes me really unpopular with certain groups out there. I detest policing language. I don't understand it at all. I read on social media and online and read blogs and hear podcasters and prominent mental health advocates talk about using person first language, and we discuss it this way, and these words are off limits, and this is how, and I just want to pull my hair out, because those exact same people are like, we need to have robust conversations surrounding mental illness and we shouldn't be afraid to talk about it.
Well, that's pretty
And
much
then
what
the
I
minute
just,
you
that's
talk
exactly
about
what
it,
I just said. That's
yeah,
pretty,
and then the minute you talk about it, they're like, not that way. You did it wrong. You should understand it. And it makes people not want to say anything because they're afraid of offending people.
right.
And I'm just like, when I was not diagnosed, when I knew nothing about bipolar disorder, and when I thought that I was normal, fine, and that everything was just peachy, but I was suffering, I did not lie awake at night and wonder if I was suffering from a mental health crisis. I wondered if I was going effing crazy. I wondered if I was going nuts. I wondered if I was a wacko. I wondered if I was insane. And then they're like, well, all those words are bad. Well, then I guess I'm bad. So now, on top of being sick, I also now have this whole faction of people telling me that what I'm doing is wrong. So now I'm sick and wrong, and you're not offering me any help. You're just policing my language. So thanks for that, I guess. And then you're telling me not to be shy and to grab the bull by the horns and to ask for help. But I did. I told you I was going crazy and I needed some help. But now you're lecturing, man, how crazy is a word we don't use anymore. Well, you know what? Thanks for nothing. And that really frustrates me, because you know how hard it was to say I'm going crazy and I need help, and yet all I got was a speech about how my language was. No, this isn't the way to do things. That said, I'm not saying that context isn't important, because context is very important.
Mm-hmm.
I'm on your show. You're very nice. You're very kind. But if you say, "Hey, Gabe's a nut job that is crazy and probably is mean to his wife," I'd be like, "What do you do?" No, that's all so incredibly rude. Like, I'd correct you on that because your context is a problem. But I'd also correct you if you said, hey, Gabe is only bipolar, and being married to somebody who's only bipolar is really hard. Now, there's no words there that are wrong, I guess. I mean, I suppose I could get you on the only bipolar thing. I mean, everybody is more than one thing, but how it still fits the language rules, but it still seems pretty condescending to
Mm-hmm.
me. So how do you deal with that? What if you're using the, I'm making air quotes, right words, but you're still being condescending? I honestly, it gets me so much, because I know how hard it is to share our emotions and our feelings and our fears. And to think that there is any barrier, no matter how well intentioned, in between that conversation really puts me on edge. I say that we just own it. If you say something to somebody and it's wrong, I think they should consider your context, what you meant by it, and that you meant well. That said, if somebody says, "Hey, please don't call me that," or "Don't use that language," or then there's a good opportunity to adjust. There's nothing wrong with that.
Right.
My full name is Gabriel, and people call me Gabriel all the time, and I immediately say, "Hey, please call me Gabe. My
Mm-hmm.
mother only calls me Gabriel when I'm in trouble." And then I would expect people to call me Gabe. I don't make a big deal about it. I don't say that you were offensive. I don't get, ticked off. I think we need to handle these things more like that. Like, if
Right.
somebody mispronounces your name, we just need to show some kindness to one
Right.
another, and stop it with these rules.
Right. Great. Good answer. And now let's turn to the book. I do.
All right, all right. We're delving into mental illness as an asshole, and some people might think I am too. Okay, good. Here we go.
So, uh, dude, this section, page 72, tips for caregivers and clinicians. I wrote, scholars, please read outside of scholarship. That is my main message. Scholars, please read outside of scholarship, and advocates, please keep sharing. Um, you know, when I was in my trajectory to become a doctor, I switched gears because I did an internship with um, a methadone clinic. It was tough. That was tough. And back in the archaic days, we didn't encourage sharing to this degree. Tell us, what do you think of people who say sharing isn't a good thing?
I don't understand that at all. I think sharing is the only thing. How can we
Yes.
connect with each other? How can we understand each other's frustrations and fears? And when I liken it to the medical community versus the lived experience community, or to say it another way, doctors versus patients, right? Therapists versus patients. How can we trust each other enough to help each other? How can I trust you to help me? Let me say it even more plainly. If I don't feel that you understand me, I think that this really permeates all areas of our life. I think that if we don't believe that the server at our favorite restaurant understands us, we're going to be fearful that they're going to get our order wrong. And that's a pretty that's a pretty low risk. Who cares, right? So your food is wrong, right? But you kind of worry about it. You ever been to a restaurant and you're like, the server's not paying attention. We haven't made a good connection. I don't feel like they're listening. I don't think they understand. And you put in your order, but you kind of got this idea in the back of your head. It's going to be messed up. Don't look forward to it. They're going to get it wrong. And it kind of weighs on you. And again, that's one meal at a restaurant. Right now, imagine this is your medical care. This is your life. This is your happiness. This is your personality. This is your brain. And you feel that way. Well, they're not listening. And now you've got to take medications. You've got to go to therapy. You've got to do introspection. And the person who is guiding you, you just have no faith in. I think that is where sharing is really, really valuable. Now, that said, there's limits. Doctors and therapists aren't our buddies. We can't be friends with them. We're not watching football games. We need to understand what these boundaries are. There is a conversation to be had about appropriate versus inappropriate, and too much information versus the right amount of information. I'm always going to be on board for that conversation, but nothing is 100%. We tend to do this in our society where we're like, good or bad, good or bad, good or bad, good or bad. I don't know. Cars are good, I get. Well, what if I run you over? Well, then cars are bad. Well, so which is it? Are cars good or bad? I see. This is the problem. Nuance matters. Middle matters. Gray matters. And I think in the age of buzzwords, we're not getting to those points. We're just yelling something that makes a good meme, and suddenly that's all anybody knows about anything. But no, to answer your specific question, sharing mostly positive.
I have by page 110. I have bipolar and anxiety disorders, and I'm a hypocrite. First of all, very creative section titles and all of this stuff. Gabe, dude, you're not a hypocrite, buddy. You were very straightforward. You said, okay, great, I've got to put on a brave face, and if I do, yeah, I might be a hypocrite, but I'm doing it for my community. But to the reader, you were very, very honest with us. You let us understand that. But just speak of that for a few minutes, because this section is how I kind of understood how tough it can be sometimes when you don't really want to.
One of the hardest parts about my job, and is balancing realism with hope. Because if you take out hope and just give everybody the nitty gritty, down and dirty, ugly bipolar disorder, who would be hopeful? Everybody would just, they're already suffering. They know the suffering. They're already struggling. They know the struggling. They're already not thriving. They know not thriving. They don't need to hear me tell them about it. That's nonsense. But if I go the other way and I'm just hope, 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 then you're not really getting any meat, right? You're not getting the information that you need. You're not getting feedback. You're not getting things that you can try at home. You're not getting foundational knowledge. You're not being given tools. And I work really, really hard to balance, hey, this chainsaw is dangerous. However, if used correctly, you can build a shelter. You can get firewood. Firewood gets you a fire where you can prepare food and stay warm. But you don't want to spend all your time talking about how dangerous the chainsaw is, or nobody will use one, and then they'll freeze to death and starve in the winter because they won't have shelter, they won't have fire, and they won't have food. But you also don't want to be like, hey, buddy, here's a chainsaw. I believe in you. And then they're going to cut their limbs off. Wow. And that's the balance. But the reason that I feel like a hypocrite sometimes is because, sometimes people are like, how are you doing with bipolar disorder? And I want to say, I'm depressed and it sucks and I'm miserable. You just happened to book your conference on a down day for me. So I'm really kind of struggling right now, and it's really hard. And then everybody in the audience, 2,000 people trying to learn about bipolar disorder, trying to get better, are just like, well, great. Everybody with bipolar disorder suffers all the time. They're just suffering and struggling. I don't want to hire people with bipolar disorder, keep them away from my kids. They're downers. And that's not a good message. Mm-hmm. That's a terrible message. So I put on the brave face, and I talk about recovery, and I talk about the positives, and I talk about the hope, and I talk about how much people with bipolar disorder can achieve. And yeah, when I walk on stage, I feel a little bit like a hypocrite, like I'm not telling the whole truth. I understand why I do it. And anybody who reads that article and anybody who heard this little, diatribe for the last couple of minutes should completely understand why I do it. But there is a frustration. There just is.
So, and you talk about mental illness as an identity, mourning the loss of mental illness as an identity. Excellent, excellent section here. So I want you just to speak of it, and we're going to tease the audience. If they want to read it, let them go buy it. But page 226.
I like that. I like that.
But tell us, what do you mean by that? First of all, mental illness as an identity, and then mourning the loss. Fascinating.
So
fascinating.
We understand in the addiction community that relapse is part of recovery. We need to understand in the mental health community that falling back on old habits, old coping skills, that is also part of recovery. And as far as it being your identity, how could it not be? People, unfortunately, don't get a mental health crisis or a mental illness and then get help immediately. They have been struggling, suffering, managing on their own. It hits you out of nowhere. And the average lead time for people to get help is measured in years. How could it not become part of your core identity and core personality? And just to reduce that to, oh, well, Gabe is self-sabotaging. No, I'm not. I'm having a symptom of my illness, and you've decided once again to blame it on me as a person. And this is so big of a conversation that we don't have time to cover it. But the number one thing that I hear from family members, friends, parents, loved ones of people with bipolar disorder is, well, they're doing it to themselves. They're doing it to themselves. And could you imagine if every single time a cancer patient vomited, they said, well, why is he throwing up? He's doing it to himself. They're doing everything they can. But unfortunately, the treatment for cancer often causes nausea. Nausea often causes vomiting. They're not doing it to themselves. Cancer and cancer treatments are doing it to them. We understand that over there, so we're compassionate. But when the same thing happens, this I'm using an analogy. When you follow that thread over on mental health, it's, well, they're self-sabotaging. Well, they don't want to get better. Well, we thought he was going to choose good this time, and he didn't. And that's very frustrating. And I know we're almost out of time, so that's all I'll say on that, because I know we got a great big last question here.
Yeah. Well, the last question is pretty much about the Dr. Phil show. Well, your show, your podcast with Dr. Phil.
Dr. Phil was a guest on the Inside Mental Health
quickly,
podcast.
He brought it to the pandemic, and he was talking about the pandemic, and he was saying that when it's over, everybody is going to be like running out in the street, and it's over, and it's just not going to be that way. And for some reason, it made me think when you were interviewing him that, okay, so is there a before and an after? Because I
for the
hear
pandemic?
No, about a diagnosis.
Ah, okay.
Yes.
I think so. Yes.
Yes.
I think you definitely have a before and after moment. There's before you knew you were sick and after you know you were sick.
Right.
You're sick the whole time.
Right. I've heard people say that they were relieved when they found out that it was a diagnosis of some kind, because then they can treat it. But I've never heard anybody say it got easier. Now, that's just from my experience. So that's the question with the before and the after. It's like things
I think
are just
having
not...
a diagnosis is a good thing, because then you, if for nothing else, then you know what to look for. Let's make it practical. As soon as I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, I knew what to search for in Google, right? A podcast called Inside Bipolar would be for me now, right? So in that way, this is really good. The did it get easier question, that's a real tough one. So in my mind, yes, it absolutely got easier, but not right away. And I think this is a case of where people remember the hits and forget the misses, or vice versa, maybe in this case, because you get diagnosed, let's say on Monday, and a week later, somebody asks you if it got easier and you say no. And a month later, they ask you if it got easier and you say no. And a few months later, they ask you if it got easier and you say no. And then they stop asking, because the reality is something like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, psychosis, it's probably not going to get better 3 months after diagnosis. So then people get in their head, oh, well, I guess a diagnosis didn't make them better. But it did make them better. You didn't catch up with them 2 years later. You didn't catch up with them 3 years later. You didn't catch up with them 4 years later. And unfortunately, because of that misunderstanding, so many people stop taking their medication after a couple of months. They stop going to doctors after a couple of months. They think that if they are not better after a couple of months, that they have treatment resistant, or they can't get better, or there's no cure for them, or whatever. They just react like this should be quick. The reality is from the time I was diagnosed with bipolar disorder to the time I reached recovery took 4 years. That is a long time. But people were asking me after a couple of months why I'm not better. And I didn't know the answer to that question. And it's one of the reasons that I became an advocate, because everything that people understand about bipolar disorder and about mental illness is frankly wrong. Television does a great disservice. Television shows somebody acting crazy, acting insane, suffering from a mental health condition. They pop a pill in their mouth and then they're perfectly normal. That is not true. That is false. That is barely how headache medication works. And headaches are much more serious, and mental illness is much more serious than a headache. So if a headache doesn't work that simply, how on earth is mental illness going to? But that's what people believe. So to your question, I think there's a lot of people who get better after a diagnosis, and whose lives get easier after a diagnosis, and who thrive after a diagnosis. But it's months, if not years, after that diagnosis, long after people give up on them and decide, I guess the diagnosis didn't help. They're not any better, because they didn't give it enough time.
Thank you, Gabe. Thank you very much. It has been a pleasure. I have been a big fan of yours for quite a few years now. And I guess the final question will be a very, very simple one. When is the next sequel, the next book or the sequel, or, when is it coming out, or what else
turns
is
out
new?
Books are really hard to write. Right now you're stuck with that one. I am trying to work on another book, but it's really, really difficult. You can find other writing if you go to gabehoward.com. You can also buy the book on gabehoward.com. I love it when people buy the book there, because one, I can sign it. And two, I can include free stuff. So if you go to gabehoward.com, you can see other writings, other podcasts. You can get a signature. You can get the book anywhere they sell books, but if you get it from GabeHoward.com, I can give you free stuff and I can sign it. So
Yes.
I highly recommend that.
So do I. Mental illness. Oh my God, this mic.
The mic loves it.
Mental illness is an asshole and other observations. Gabe Howard. Listen, I really do recommend the book. And again, scholars, stay in school, but also rely on the shared experiences of people who have been there. You know, honestly, if this kind of thing was around when I was in my master's and doctorate degree, I would have been a much happier person. So thank you, Gabe. It's been great,
Thank you
man.
so much for having me. It's
Great
been
conversation.
wonderful.
All the best.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Talk soon.
Talk to you soon. And do not go anywhere. Let me get a picture.
All right.